Bidenomics today. Joe Biden just gave a speech about Bidenomics, and let's hear what he had to say specifically about wages in America.
Look, pay for low-wage workers has grown at the fastest pace in over 2 decades. Full employment means workers, especially low-wage workers, having more bargaining power to demand good pay, secure good jobs. And this is a thing that isn't consistent with whether people think that we're moving in the right direction. Job satisfaction based on every
Okay, let's just stop with that one point. Okay, he talks about something called people with their wages, wage growth, and people being able. That's what he's talking about. He's saying people are better off today than they were before his presidency in terms of wages. So are they? Are people actually better off? Well, first of all, we all know inflation's existed. Inflation's been out of control, and I'll show you how out of control here as we go through this. But the fact of the matter is, let's just go straight to the data in terms of average wage earnings. Average wage earnings, and this is a chart from the Bureau of Labor Statistics that I'm showing you right now. And here's what it is. And this is from 2016 to 2023, I've chosen. During Donald Trump, during his administration, he took over in January of 2017. Real wages were down 0.6 in January, 0.4 in February, and 0.1 in March of 2017. After that, real wages increased for Americans across the board from April to January of 2020, where it went down by 0.1%. And then you go back on a roll through 2020, even with the pandemic, you go back through a roll of wages being higher than inflation. Now remember, and I'll show you a chart that shows you how that works. But now let's go to Joe Biden. Joe Biden, first 3 months of the Joe Biden administration, starting in 2021, real wages were up 5.9%, 4.1%, 4.1% for January, February, March. Since April of 2021, real wages have declined in this country every single month. Every single month. What does that mean to you? It means that there's inflation is higher than the wage increase you received on average. Okay, that's what it means. It means that, very simply, you have a massive loss in the real buying power of your dollars. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. Something Joe Biden doesn't want to tell you. But I'm not telling you anything you don't know. You know the cost of eggs is more than it was 3 years ago. You know that your paycheck doesn't stretch as far. I mean, just take a look at this chart that we've kind of combined a chart. The red number is inflation, and I'm just going to do the same 5-year period here. So the red chart, this number is inflation. Okay. This is Donald Trump. Trump's president 2018. I don't go all the way through the Trump presidency, but you can see inflation's low. It's 2%. It's all throughout here. It gets up, noses up about 2.5% in 2019. But earnings, the blue line, earnings are significantly higher. Why is that? It's because when you get down to it, there were more jobs than there were people seeking those jobs. The people who are the biggest beneficiaries are people in the lowest 20% of the wage earners, because those are the jobs that needed filling. Those are the jobs that where you had a surplus population going after, or surplus number of jobs going after fewer and fewer employees. And as a result, people at the bottom end of the economic spectrum did better under Donald Trump. And that's just true. You can't deny it. It is factually, demonstrably true. And I'm showing you the chart that shows it. Now you have the pandemic. What happens? We spend a ton of money in the pandemic, and it's about $7 trillion all told, extra money. And so you see the average weekly earnings go through the chart growth in April 2020. That's largely because of people unemployed. You have an unemployment rate at that point that goes from 3.8%, 3.7% all the way up to 23%, I believe. I'll show you the number. But you have this disparity here, but you have inflation begin to go up, and then you have the Biden administration starts right there. That's where Biden starts. Biden immediately passes a bill to make the economy recover. And lo and behold, what did he do? You can just see inflation goes through the roof. Until June of 2022, inflation rate was about 9%. Okay. So while your earnings, the blue line, were making more money, 4%, 5% more, the value of your dollar was dramatically being cut. And so your real wages were destroyed. And that is the effect of the Bidenflation. So whose fault was Bidenflation? Well, according to Larry Summers, it was Joe Biden's fault. Larry Summers, who is he? He's Harvard economist, former Treasury Secretary, not in the Republican administration, but in the Obama administration. So what does he say? He says the following. In a column he published February 2021, this is right when this policy was being implemented. He questioned the size of the Biden's $1.9 trillion COVID relief proposal. There is a chance that macroeconomic stimulus on a scale closer to World War II levels than normal recession levels will set off inflationary pressures of a kind we have not seen in a generation. This is the New Yorker, that conservative publication, the New Yorker. At the time that column appeared, the rate of consumer price inflation was below 2%. Today, it stands at 7.9%. Now, we know it went up another percentage point after that. So Larry Summers blames Biden for the inflation. And if you blame Biden for the inflation, then you have to blame Biden for the real wages going through the roof. What's the monetary policy look like? This is from the St. Louis Fed. And you can see right here, we've got, what is how much money is being put in the economy by the federal government and by the Fed. And so February 10, 2020, right before the shutdown and the COVID crisis, you were on a pretty steady increase of your M2. And then all of a sudden it goes boom. It jumps from 15.3 trillion to 18.1 trillion, and then continues going up. You can see and then suddenly the COVID spending sort of flattens out. And so the M2 in the economy is down to 20.6 trillion because essentially the spending worked its way through the economy. This is the inflation boom. Now, how did it work its way through the economy? It's very simple. You had massive increases in interest rates, which ate up the Fed. It ate up the money, at least a portion of it. So that's how you end up with a chart that looks like this, where you end up with your inflation way higher, your wages lower, and this gap is how much money you're losing every single month because of Biden economics, Bidenomics, as he wants to call it. So, folks, the question always has been, are you better off today than you were before? That's usually the political question that gets asked. And anybody who's sitting around the dinner table asking that question themselves looks around and say, wait a second, my money doesn't go as far. I'm having to work extra to make the same amount of money and to have the same spending power. We're seeing that people are, in fact, borrowing more. The credit card debt is growing dramatically because people are saying, I'm putting it on a card and hoping that I can afford to pay in the future. So you're seeing credit cards being maxed out. You're seeing 20 million people are behind on the utility bills now because they have to make the car payment, they have to make the house payment, but maybe they can put off the utility payment and just kind of and just hope to get by. That's what we're seeing right now. So when you get down to all this shenanigans, when everything's said and done, when Joe Biden is judged on his economy, he wants to be judged on his economy. He has to be judged on his economy. And his economy is one where the average person is working harder and getting less for the wage that they earn. That is what his economy is. He can tell you, oh, your wages are up, because people's wages are up. But what he can't tell you is that your money is worth more than it was before. He can't tell you that because he can tell you because he doesn't let the truth get in the way. He can't honestly tell you that. And the fact is, that is not true. You know that the dollar, how far your dollar stretches, it is smaller and smaller and smaller. And there's no going back, because these kind of cuts, when you have inflation, it's cumulative. It builds on one another. You can't put that genie back in the bottle. You just are starting at where the worth of the dollar starts at a new spot every single day as it goes up. But you're not going to go backwards and say, oh, well, suddenly I'm going to go back and buy a soda for 23 cents like I used to be able to do back when I was a kid. Okay, you're not going to go back that way. So it's all upward, and you've basically reset the baseline with this massive inflation that was fueled by Bidenomics. So let him talk all he wants about stuff. He can talk about the jobs, and I'll just show you some jobs data because I think it's interesting. Here's the jobs data for since the last decade. And you can see this is the number in the civilian labor force. This is how many people are non-institutionalized, not in the military, 18 and above. So you can see 155 million in 10 years ago, peaks up at 164 million, a little over that. Right when we get the pandemic hits, boom, the number of people in the job workforce goes down dramatically. All these people, and a lot more end up, some people just drop out of the workforce altogether. Then it goes back up, and you see it just gradually creep up. And now it's finally peaked up above where it was in January of 2020. Okay. So then you go to the employment level. It's again, the same kind of chart. 159 million people employed in 2020, January 2020. This is kind of the peak employment that Donald Trump achieved. Then you have the pandemic that drops that number down to like 132. And then you go and you regain about 15 million of those jobs. And then gradually, through Biden, you regain more of those jobs. And this is a simple fact. This isn't obvious. As the economy reopened, as states and localities were ending their draconian shutdowns of their local economies, you saw the jobs creep back up. But these are not, so he's saying, okay, I created all these jobs, but the fact is he didn't create any of those jobs. This is a natural progression back to normal. And if you notice, when you look at the number of people employed, you note that 2 years into his administration, you're just barely above the number of people employed at the peak of the Donald Trump administration in 2020. And as a result, you got about 2 million more people employed since 2020. It's nice, but on a normal progression with your normal amount of people growing in terms of your people eligible to be in the market, that's normative. That's normal. So your actual number of people employed, new people employed since he took office, is, if you put this you look at this chart, 149,871 was when Donald Trump was his last month in office. So you say, okay, 160. So he's got about 2 million more people employed. Actually, that's 11 million more people employed, 10 million more people employed since then. That's this number. I mean, that's this. And that's all about the pandemic and recovering from the pandemic. It has nothing to do with Biden policies. Um, Once again, you look at unemployment levels. The unemployment levels essentially return to normal, return to Trump levels. And congratulations, Mr. President, but you're effectively claiming success over returning to the levels that your predecessor achieved pre-pandemic. So, that's a good, congratulations, but you should be praising Donald Trump for what he did to bring the levels down to where they were. Unemployment rate, once again, you see the same chart. Not in the labor force. Here's the number that people should be concerned about. And I don't want to do a whole labor thing here, but as you remember, I was in public affairs, the Labor Department under Bush, under W. So we pay attention to this stuff. Not in the labor force. Non-labor force was 95 million when the pandemic hit. Non-labor force is now 100 million. That's the number that never recovered. That never recovered post-pandemic. Partially because you have more people who are seniors who retired and didn't come back because they were seniors. But you have a pretty steady run at 100 million, basically 5 million people who were in the labor force 3 years ago and aren't in the labor force now. And if you don't, and that is a pretty big problem, because these are 5 million people who are not producing, who are not doing anything, and there's very little. The Biden administration policies, he takes over right there. The Biden administration policies have done very little to affect this number, and this is the number that is going to really be determinative as to whether or not we're able to grow our economy. Because if we continue to be stagnant in terms of number of people in the workforce, or relatively slow growing in terms of number of people in the workforce, if we continue along that pathway, it makes it very, very difficult to grow our economy, because our economy depends on a growing workforce. So that's the charts. So go through the numbers again. Let's look at one last thing on here that I think is interesting. Actually, no, I'm tired of the numbers. Let's look at what people have to say, just for fun, grins and giggles. Because I know you've been watching Biden and all this. I want to see what you've got to say about it. Going to the top, Greg Anderson. Let's see what Greg has to say. Biden's a liar. I pay more and get less for everything since Biden took office. I also lost $70K for my 401K. Greg, well, you just said that in one line, what I just said in about 20 minutes. So thank you for that. If I just read that, I could say, well, that closes the thing. Hopefully, by seeing how some of the numbers work, it helps you be able to back that up, not just from your own personal experience, which is, I think, shared by a lot of people, but it also provides you the ability to say, wait a second, when you look at wages versus inflation, Joe Biden has been a disaster for this country, because that's just absolutely 100% true. Buddy Eskew, I believe no numbers put out by any Democrat, especially you know who. Well, he does have a way of making stuff up. Ironically, his big Bidenomics speech was mainly pushing more government spending in the Green New Deal. As you read the breadth of it, or you watch the whole thing, he spends a whole lot of time talking about the Green New Deal, a whole lot of time talking about infrastructure and the like, and spending more money, and no time claiming credit for the fact that he didn't do the one thing he needed to do. I mean, remember this. Joe Biden is saying, let's stay the course. Let's finish the job. Bidenomics is good. But what did Joe Biden want to do when it came to the debt ceiling? I know a lot of us are disappointed that there wasn't enough cuts in the debt ceiling deal. But the fact of the matter is, Joe Biden wanted no cuts in the debt ceiling deal. Joe Biden wanted to continue on spending as normal. And what Kevin McCarthy and the Republicans negotiated was a significant cut in the deficit, in the spending. In fact, it was comparable to what was negotiated by Boehner with Obama back in the early 2010s. So very comparable between the two, about 1.9% cut in spending. Yeah, it's over 10 years, but it's 1.9% cut in spending. So when we look at it, Joe Biden wanted to continue on the path of spend, spend, spend. His budget for 2023 was $6.7 trillion, up from 6.27 trillion spent in 2022. That's what he wanted. That's what his idea was. That's his big idea. Let's continue to spend at post-pandemic levels and not cut any of our spending that grew because of the pandemic. So that's his big idea. Republicans confronted him on it and said, no, we're not going to give a debt ceiling increase unless we make cuts. Once again, were the cuts as big as some of us had hoped? No, they weren't. The fact is there were cuts. And Joe Biden there would be no cuts if the Republicans hadn't stood up and said, no, we're not going to do this. We're not going to continue down this path of insanity. We're going to try to get things under control, at least to some degree. And this is so Biden's stay the course. We're going to continue spending and just accelerating off a cliff. At least that was slowed somewhat. Now, we didn't get rolling it back to 2019 spending levels, pre-COVID levels. That would have been a good thing, but we weren't able to do that. Weren't able to move it back 5 months in terms of the baseline. Weren't able to do that. Joe Biden wouldn't agree. So what ends up happening? You get cuts and 1.9% cuts over 10 years, and you move on and you try to get more cuts next time. Joe Biden will fight those cuts every inch of the way. He will fight those cuts every single inch of the way. So when he talks about Bidenomics, understand, he talks about deficit spending and all this stuff, and he's going to talk about how he's lowered deficit spending. Well, no, the COVID spending ran out. The spending that he pushed through Congress ran out. And so, of course, the spending went down because you weren't spending massive amounts of money on COVID. And the last tranche of it, at the very least, the tranche he pushed through, was completely and totally unnecessary and caused the inflationary spiral that we ended up in. So, yeah, the COVID spending ended. We should see the budget deficit go down. But no thanks to him. But he'll take credit for it because that's what politicians do. Dave Nelson, Biden and his administration associates along with Biden voters and supporters are responsible for the continued disastrous failures against America and American people. This is what Biden voters and supporters voted for: chaos and destruction. I cannot disagree with you, Dave. It is. I don't know that they meant to vote for chaos and destruction, but that certainly is the net result of their vote. And it's what Biden is trying to sell. The continued lurching between crises that we see. One of the big jokes when I was watching his speech, I just kept hovering over, was he talked about the hollowing out of America and how jobs were being sent overseas and all this. And I'm like, Joe, that was you. That wasn't about economic fiscal policy. That was about trade policy. He was giving the speech that Donald Trump was giving in 2015 about the hollowing out of America. You know, it's amazing how suddenly Joe Biden wants to talk about the dangers of hollowing out America when it was the Obama trade agenda and the Bush trade agenda and the Clinton trade agenda and the Bush trade agenda. And yes, probably even the Reagan trade agenda that led to the hollowing out of America. Had nothing to do with fiscal policy, had everything to do with trade policy. He talked about laws that make it make sense to export jobs overseas. Well, you were in the Senate for 40 years. You don't get to complain about the laws you didn't fight about. You didn't fight over. The laws you didn't fight to change when your side had control. You don't get to complain about that. You own those things. He had 8 years as vice president. He changed those? No. When he was doing his trade policy was basically, I'm going to go visit a country and see how much money I can get for Hunter out of the deal with the 10% for the big guy. That was his trade policy. It was all personal trade policy, and it was give me cash and I'll go ahead and we'll give you something you want. wasn't about the American worker. It was about him. And you can't pretend otherwise. He can't pretend otherwise. Hollowing out of America, the one person who stood up and said no to that was Donald J. Trump. He said, no, 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 that will end under mine. Joe Biden, the vice president for Barack Obama, they negotiated the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They negotiated Trans-Pacific Partnership. He's the foreign policy expert. He has to take credit for that, responsibility for that. It was Donald J. Trump who said, no, we're not doing this. It's a bad deal for America. It's Donald Trump who said, no, we're going to do everything we can. We're going to put some tariffs on aluminum and steel from all over the world because China's dumping their steel into America to kill our steel industry and our aluminum industry. It's Donald J. Trump that said, wait a second, we're having aluminum plants basically deconstructed and transported whole to China, along with his jobs, but also with the capability to produce aluminum here domestically. And he fought to change that. That's Donald Trump. It's not Joe Biden. If you want to get rid of the hollowing out of America, you have to reject Joe Biden because he is emblematic of every economic ill that came down the path based upon his 40 years in the Senate and 8 years as vice president. He doesn't get to say, gee, I had nothing to do with that. I'm brand new on the scene. He was responsible for hollowing out America. It was Donald Trump who took on the establishment, took on the Clintons, took on all the left and right, and said, we're not going to trade away America's future anymore. We're going to worry about American jobs. We're going to put America first, as opposed to worrying about exporting our wealth to places around the world that don't like us very much. That was Donald J. Trump's policy. And that's the policy that Joe Biden directly rejects. So when he talks about hollowing out of America, folks, understand he's sitting there with, he might be pointing one finger this way, but he's got three pointed back at him because he is the emblem of the failed policies that led to the NAFTA agreement, led to our opening up PNTR with China. He never pushed to end PNTR. He has permanent normalized trade relations with China. Has Joe Biden jumped on and said, hey, I'm president now, we're going to end the permanent normalized trade relations with China and take away China's competitive advantage in trade with the United States? You ever do that? No. He owns the mistakes of the past because he is a mistake from the past. This is Rick Manning, hoping that you will share this and give it to your friends and hopefully make sure people get to see this rebuttal to the Biden economics speech. With that, I'm going to wish you all well and have a great day.